From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
Opening arguments and the first witness taking the stand in Donald Trump's hush money trial in New York. The prosecution calling Trump's actions election fraud. Pure and simple.
Plus, aid money for Israel and Ukraine clearing the House of Representatives. President Biden pledging to sign the $95 billion package into law after an expected Senate vote tomorrow or Wednesday. We'll discuss what it could mean on the front lines with retired Army Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt.
And President Biden marking Earth Day, delivering a speech in Virginia on climate change. We'll be joined by former White House National Climate Advisor and EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy this hour. So, Joe, obviously Biden did make that trip down to Virginia in order to commemorate Earth Day. But before he did so, he had a phone conversation with the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, saying that as soon as I sign the bill, we'll get aid to you quickly.
A relieved President Zelensky. Of course, this is 6 months in the waiting, the money that's going to be going to Ukraine. Now, he actually talked about it, Zelensky, on NBC's Meet the Press just yesterday. Kaylee, here's what he said.
This aid will strengthen Ukraine and send the Kremlin a powerful signal that it will not be the second Afghanistan.
But it's not quite a done deal yet. It does still have to get through the United States Senate. So for joining us now for more on that is Bloomberg's Mike Dorning, who helps lead our congressional coverage. So, Mike, it is expected to pass the Senate. I suppose it's just a question of when and whether or not any individual senator like, say, Rand Paul wants to hold things up over the course of the next day or two.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to pass the Senate on either Tuesday or Wednesday. You can kind of take that to the bank. It's just a question of whether Rand Paul, maybe a few other conservatives, delay it from Tuesday to Wednesday.
Okay, so from there, the president signs the bill, and then there are questions about what happens after that. It could be some weeks before this material to Ukraine specifically. We're talking about a lot of stuff. Some of it is ready. Mike, some of it still needs to be manufactured.
Yes, no, a lot of this is talking about manufacturing weapons in the United States, mostly to replace stuff that's been taken from U.S. Army stocks. But we do know that there is equipment, there is material that's already been being put in place by the Biden administration. So we would expect at least some of that to come pretty quickly.
Well, of course, this isn't just, at the end of the day, a foreign aid bill. To get it through the House, there was also a sidecar package that included a number of things, including the TikTok divest or ban bill, slightly tweaked from what the House originally passed. There's now a year-long period in which ByteDance could divest the U.S. arm of TikTok. But is that going to cause any problems in the Senate, knowing the rest of the bill looks pretty similar to something the Senate already had passed? But that wasn't in it, and not all senators were thrilled about it initially.
Yeah, now, it looks a lot like what the House had passed previously, but as you noted, some people in the Senate were pushing back on some provisions, including the Commerce Committee chair, important person on this. And as a consequence, partly to satisfy her, they extended the period that he could divest for up to 6 months more. And obviously, from TikTok's standpoint, all that lobbying in some ways even though they didn't get what they wanted, they got a good return because they got 6 months more revenues out of this for sure. So there were those tweaks. That said, this is going to pass the Senate. They're not going to have any problem with it that would cause them to vote against the foreign aid bill.
Talk to us about Speaker Johnson. Mike, there are 3 Republicans who have signed on to a motion to vacate, threatening to fire him. Marjorie Taylor Greene, as recently as today, says she plans to make good on that threat. But Donald Trump is waiting in the wings, and we are told he doesn't want to see another speaker fight in the throes of a campaign season. Is Mike Johnson as good as protected? Is he safe as long as Donald Trump feels that way?
Well, I think he's, at least for the time being, probably safe from overthrow unless Donald Trump were to affirmatively weigh in on this. I think you're right. Donald Trump has shown he doesn't want this sideshow in the House, but also, more importantly, whether or not Democrats as a whole back Johnson, and they might very well, We know that there are some national security Democrats, including Adam Smith, who you had on your program just last week, saying if the Ukraine aid is passed, I would come in reserve and support him. So we know for sure that some national security Democrats would sort of help keep Johnson in power, and maybe even more of them. So unless there was some big thing that caused a lot of Republicans to revolt against him, then I think he's pretty safe for the time being. That doesn't mean that these people can't make life miserable for Johnson.
Sure, yeah.
And they say their whole strategy is to make him so miserable that he quits.
That he retires or resigns. I don't know. It seems like Mike Johnson might not be losing a lot of sleep over this week, but we'll see what happens when they all return. Mike Dorning, thank you very much. Elsewhere today, lawyers making opening statements in former President Donald Trump's hush money case in New York. The former president spoke with reporters earlier today.
I should be in Florida now. I should be in a lot of different places right now campaigning, and I'm sitting here. And this will go on for a long time. It's very unfair. The judge is conflicted, as you know. It's very unfair what's going on. And I should be allowed to campaign.
For more, let's bring in Bloomberg's Peggy Collins with us at the table. Peggy, the narrative until now has been that this is actually helping Donald Trump. He's been raising money. He's been using the courtroom as a platform to deliver the message. We're going to start hearing from witnesses. We did for a brief period of time today. Dave Pecker was on the stand, but we're going to start hearing from Stormy Daniels, from Michael Cohen. The stories are going to start to get ugly. Could this be the beginning of this narrative turning against Donald Trump?
Well, I think that's one of the things we're going to have to follow. I think a lot of the facts in the case actually have been known for a long time, but now it's playing out in front of the American public at this incredibly unprecedented and historic time where you have Trump as the frontrunner for the election in November, and the split screen that's there in terms of Biden being able to go out and campaign in different states. And as the former president was saying, he's in a New York courtroom. The flip side, though, to that for Trump is that he's getting a lot of free media, which is very expensive. But with the covering of the court case, that's certainly something that he gets every day he's in court, except for Wednesdays for the next several weeks at least. We had a story on the Bloomberg Wire today about how Trump spent about $4.9 million just in March alone on legal fees, and that he's left with about $6.8 million unless he starts to dip into other funds for this. So that differential in terms of money, but also free media at the same time, is really going to be something we have to watch.
Yeah, especially as he's trying to actively fight multiple legal cases at the same time he's trying to run a presidential campaign. And of course, it's him versus Biden in terms of the Republican and Democratic presumptive nominee. But there also is the potential for third parties to be disruptive here, Peggy, including if you look at NBC's poll from over the weekend. Trump holds a 2-point edge over Biden when it's head to head. You add third parties, including RFK Jr. to the mix, and Biden leads Trump by 2 points in that ballot. So does that suggest that actually the spoiler may spoil more for Trump than the incumbent president?
Well, I think either way, 2 points is really razor thin. So I think in our poll and in an NBC poll, the numbers are so close that a third party candidate could draw from both. And in either case, it could be what causes the election to flip from one to the other. I think it's important that over the last week or so that RFK got on the ballot in Michigan, one of those swing states. So that's going to be incredibly important to watch. And the other is just where the independents go, because they're so important right now. And that may make the difference, as well as turnout. So it's, do people come out? Because as the NBC poll shows and our polls have showed, many people want neither candidate in this election. And that will be something that we have to watch very closely.
We've got a big day coming up this week for Donald Trump here in Washington before the Supreme Court. The immunity argument will be heard. Arguments will be heard on Thursday. We just finished talking about this sensational criminal trial that's getting underway in New York. Are we to believe that, as they say, any press is good press?
Well, I think that one thing that is true is that he's getting national press every day that he's in court, and as the multiple court cases compound. But also, this is completely unprecedented in terms of the American public getting tuned into two main things. That really it is Biden and Trump, which I think a lot of people were not thinking it would ultimately end up being that. And then also how they feel once they get more details in these legal cases as they tune in over the next several months.
I haven't mentioned the name Nikki Haley in a while, have we? Our thanks to Bloomberg's Peggy Collins. Great to see you at the table, Peggy. Coming up, we'll turn to the war in Ukraine and the potential impacts of the U.S. aid package. A conversation ahead with retired Army Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think within a few days, once it passes the Senate, certain critical things like artillery can probably be delivered to Ukraine, though it might take longer for Ukraine to distribute that within the country. And then other systems that are stateside will take longer to be able to deliver again to Ukraine. But it will, it will be weeks to months probably before it has a very significant effect.
Stimson Center senior fellow Kelly Grieco speaking with us on the early edition of Balance of Power as the $95 billion aid package we've been discussing for Ukraine and Israel moves through Congress. It passed the House over the weekend. The hard part, now it's on to the Senate, and joining us to discuss the next steps, retired Army Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt. General, it's great to see you. Welcome back to the table. The new aid will not begin to affect the situation on the front lines for several weeks, according to the Institute for the Study of War. We know Ukraine has a troop shortage. We know that Russia saw this period of time coming. Is it possible for Ukraine to turn this around, get back on the offensive, or is this now about strengthening Ukraine's hand for the negotiating table?
Well, I think it will allow Ukraine to defend the front lines for this fighting season. I don't think we're at the point where this aid alone will allow them to conduct a counteroffensive. But I think that we've got to realize that Russia is making gains, and the most important thing is to stop those gains, to reinforce the lines. We've got to make sure that the Russians can't advance much further. I believe that we'll get the ammunition there much quicker than the Stimson Center believes. Yeah. I think if we were smart, and I think DOD is smart, they've pre-positioned much of that ammunition already in pre-positioned stocks. Mm-hmm. So I think it'll get to the battlefield quickly. But there is still a massive numerical advantage on the part of the Russians right now in terms of ammunition and personnel, for that matter.
Okay, so when you say this fighting season, what length of time are we realistically talking about that this will support Ukraine for? Because it was really hard to get this done. It took months. I have no idea if it's likely that something like this could get done again. So how long does this give Ukraine before it would need to be re-upped?
Well, the fighting season starts in the late fall. Things get muddy. Russia calls it Mother Mud as one of their greatest defensive capabilities. So I think between now and October is the time that the focus of the Ukrainians ought to be to defend and then use the winter time to get ready for a counteroffensive in 2025. I said that 2 years ago, and we didn't have much of a counteroffensive in 2023. So I think Ukraine will be lucky to hold out until 2025 in order to do a counteroffensive of any kind.
If that's the case, and you've got lawmakers here, and we hear this, Kaylee, on a regular basis on this program, asking for an exit plan, at what point are we talking about the negotiating table? Well,
that's really up to President Zelensky and how long he wants to hold out. I think we've got to understand if he starts calling for negotiations right now, Vladimir Putin will love those calls for negotiations. And you can bet the terms will be tough and the terms will be harsh. I don't think we're at the point now where Zelensky needs to do that. The most important thing the supplemental does is give him a morale boost and his troops a morale boost to keep fighting for some time longer. Mm-hmm.
But I guess it's still, we return to the question we've really been asking since this conflict began, General, which is Ukraine capable of outright winning this war? Or do we only need to think in terms of what a mediated victory could look like?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I think we've been doing everything in the United States to prevent them from having a victory. This shackling that we have done, the restrictions that we put on the equipment that we provide to them, the low, slow pace of weapons getting into them, I think has been as helpful to a Russian victory as Vladimir Putin being able to turn his entire military defense complex back on.
I want to ask you about the situation in Israel while you're with us. General, we've spent a lot of time focused on Ukraine since that was a much more pronounced debate, a difficult one to Kaylee's point. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, took some questions about war crimes in Gaza talking with reporters earlier today. Let's listen to what he said and have you respond.
We are looking into reports, incidents that are brought to our attention, and we have a process to do that, particularly if there are questions about whether U.S. arms have been involved, and that is ongoing, and we are continue to be focused on that.
The administration continues to walk this very fine line in supporting Israel while condemning some of its actions in Gaza. We haven't talked a lot about what's in this package for Israel, helping to replenish the Iron Dome, for instance. Right. What will this precede when it comes to Israel's next move? We saw its military response to Iran. Is Rafah next?
Rafah certainly is next. The fact remains that the situation between Iran and Israel was almost a sideshow to Gaza. This was a response and counter-response to the targeting of IRGC officers inside of Damascus. Yeah. But I think now that that particular issue seems to be settled, it'd be very clear to me that I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is looking to get back on the road to Rafah. And these issues about war crimes, and the defense of Secretary Blinken, it's not his decision. This is hard black-letter law imposed by the United States Congress. It's not his choice. He has to follow the law on what's known as the Leahy Law.
Well, there's also around these questions of human rights violations reporting in the New York Times today that suggests the U.S. is considering imposing sanctions on at least one, if not more, Israeli battalions accused of human rights violations. Can the U.S. be imposing sanctions on an army that it also has pledged to act in support of, to help defend? How can these things happen simultaneously?
Well, let's be very clear. That's what I was referring to. If there are credible reports of human rights violations by an organization that has provided funding and equipment and training by the United States, they have to stop that. It's called the Leahy Law from 1997. It's been in place. It was in place when I was at State Department. We've imposed it in other countries. The most effective fighting force outside the counterterrorism service in Iraq during the fight in Mosul was the federal police. But 2 years later, in 2019, there were credible reports of human rights violations during the Tishreen riots. And that unit caused the United States to invoke the Leahy Law, to meet the conditions of the Leahy Law, and that unit is still, quote, sanctioned as well. They're just following the law.
We're going to watch this legislation move to the Senate tomorrow, where Bernie Sanders is expected to stand up and call for an amendment to attach strings to Israeli funding, conditions based on Israel's behavior in Gaza. Would it be more effective to just enforce the conditions that are already in place with this type of foreign aid?
Well, let's be clear. The good senator is talking about all units. When you reduce the amount of funding to the Israeli military, it affects all units. There are no credible reports of other units intentionally violating human rights. Of course, that could be argued in a court of law right now in terms of how the conduct of the war is going on.
They'll point to the deaths of civilians, though.
They'll point to the deaths of civilians, but there's an intentionality requirement there. When Hamas wraps themselves around innocent civilians as human shields, they're the ones, in my mind, that are guilty of human rights violations.
All right. Retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt, always great to see you here in studio and rely on your expertise. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, coming up still, Mexico's leading presidential candidate talking U.S. politics with Bloomberg. We'll have highlights from that conversation next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think it will be good whether President Biden or President Trump wins. We have a very strong economic integration with the United States. We are now the principal trading partner, and that requires us to have a good relationship. Now, I think that obviously we are always going to defend Mexicans abroad. We are not in favor of any discriminatory discourse, but there is going to be a good relationship.
Mexican presidential candidate Claudia Sheinbaum weighing in on the race for the White House, speaking with Bloomberg on the sidelines of Mexico's annual banking convention in Acapulco. And, Joe, it's so interesting to hear her say that essentially, regardless of whether it's a second Trump administration or a second Biden administration, Mexico, in her eyes, will treat it very similarly, when surely there are differences in policies, not just when it comes to trade, but also when it comes to the border. How often do we hear Republicans, when talking about the border under Biden, decrying essentially that things that were done in the Trump administration, like the Remain in Mexico policy, were unwound during this administration?
Well, that's for sure. And boy, we spend so much time talking about this, as it's frequently in our polling the most important issue, the border, specifically to your point, the most important issue to voters. And we hear typically Americans talking about it. To actually hear someone like this coming from south of the border is important to us. She did address the issues surrounding immigration and border security as part of this conversation. Let's listen.
In as much as there is development in Central America and in other countries that people unfortunately want to leave for economic reasons, the long-term vision is that there should be investment and support in those areas. So, if a part of what the U.S. allocates to war were instead destined to investment for peace, we would be talking about a natural decrease in migration.
It's interesting to hear these comments as President Biden again attempts to narrow the definition of asylum and what's expected to be executive action that he talked to Univision about weeks ago. Kaylee, we haven't heard a peep about it since then. But if you go back to that deal that fell apart in the Senate, that was also the attempt that they were making at that time. It just never got to the House, see the light of day.
Right. It died a very quick death in the Senate, in fact. And of course, it's interesting that essentially we have now seen the House pass and the Senate be about to pass a bill that has almost everything in it that was included in that border deal, just without the border component. And also interesting to hear from her there, Joe, on this idea that there are economic reasons why people are migrating from this region to the United States, which goes back to the root causes argument that we heard more often earlier in this administration when Vice President Harris was put in charge of the border and the root cause issue. Now, though, it seems that this is much more a conversation domestically about just securing the border itself, not as much about why people are coming to the border.
That's true. And when we talk about asylum, it's, economic issues are not going to be considered part of the conversation if they do tighten the loop on that. This is going to be exclusive to people who are essentially running from violence in their home countries, not just economic straits. So we're not done talking about this anytime soon in Washington, and we'll continue to cover this debate for you here on Balance of Power. Coming up, President Biden marking Earth Day with new investments in energy alternatives. We're going to speak with his former White House National Climate Advisor, Gina McCarthy. It's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
On this day 54 years ago, with literally toxic rivers burning, air full of pollution, millions of Americans from every age and background rallied together to stand for our environment and for future generations.
That was President Biden earlier commemorating Earth Day. He traveled to Prince William Forest Park, a national park in Virginia, where he also announced nearly $7 billion in grants for residential solar projects, as the president tries to make sustainability a key component of his re-election campaign. For more, we're joined now by President Biden's former White House National Climate Advisor. Gina McCarthy also served as the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency under the Obama administration. Gina, great to have you here on Earth Day. Thank you so much for joining us. Clearly, we have seen this administration in particular take a lot of action directed toward climate. They've also set some pretty ambitious goals, including having a net zero emissions economy by no later than 2050. How far away is the U.S. from being able to achieve those kind of goals? As we take stock on this Earth Day, are we really on the right track?
Well, as you know, I'm wearing my green. So the first thing I need to say is Happy Earth Day. It is really exciting to be with you, and I'm glad to see President Biden out, because President Biden and Kamala Harris, their administration has done more for climate, more for clean energy, more for environmental justice, and more for our health and well-being than any administration has ever done, and it's exciting. And you know, today he's talking about a plethora of new ideas and programs and policies, and it's just exciting to see all this happen on Earth Day. But obviously, we need to do a lot. We've been working at this issue of climate change for some time, and we're going to be working on it for time well beyond when I'm around. And I just am excited to see so much good things happening and so much more commitment and so much more investment. Because look, nothing is more important than our future. Nothing is more important than keeping our kids and our grandkids healthy and keeping us all safe. And that's what tackling climate change is all about. That's what all of these programs and policies are really focused on doing. And it's exciting to see that all these new ideas keep coming up. And all of them are opportunities to save us money, to keep our families healthy, and keep us all safe. So this is a really good day. It's a good day.
Well, of course, Gina, the Biden administration has framed itself as the most climate-friendly administration of all time. But it's also true that the U.S. is producing more oil now than ever as well. How do you rationalize those two things?
Well, one of the things that the president did coming out when he first took office was to make it very clear that his job at that point was to make sure that we could stabilize our country. And he did that. He's moved beyond COVID. He's actually now progressing in terms of making sure that clean energy is actually competing effectively against fossil fuels. I mean, we found that last year was the best year of clean energy deployment ever. And so he keeps recognizing that, yes, we need to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels, but it's enormously important to do it in a way that continues to move as fast as we can, but do it in a way that nobody is left behind, in a way that we always have that clean energy to rely on, in a way that we can make sure that we're expediting the reduction in fossil fuels, but doing it in a way that makes sure that our communities are safe and we achieve the kind of climate reductions we need. But it's challenging. You know, we know that the fossil fuel industry isn't interested in that transition and certainly isn't investing in it. And so there's hard decisions that have to keep coming up, but I'm sure and I'm confident that the president can handle this, and he can do both reduce advance clean energy while we focus on transitioning away from fossil fuels.
Well, Gina, it's also true that only so much of this is in President Biden's control. There are billions of us that are sharing this planet. How much is what the U.S. is doing worth if China and India, some of these other big emitters, aren't necessarily pursuing it with the same vigor, shall we say?
Well, that's one of the reasons why we all get together and we go to climate conferences of the parties to make sure that there's a clear understanding that, yes, the U.S. is a large emitter. We have to understand that, and we have to address it. But this president and this administration is doing everything it can to make people understand that we are providing leadership here. Look, the Inflation Reduction Act was the biggest climate legislation that's ever been passed anywhere in the world, I would argue. I mean, it's $352 billion investment in clean energy, and it's working. We are seeing both red and blue states actually grabbing this money because this is our future. This is how we will not just address climate change, but make that shift to less expensive energy. That's what this is all about. And so it's challenging, but every country needs to engage, including us. And I think one of the reasons why this administration is working so hard is we had to recoup and maintain and renew our leadership in this climate space. And I think they've done just that. So it's going to be a hard next 5 years, I think, maybe more. But right now, the U.S. is on track to actually reduce our climate emissions by 30% in 2030, and in half by 2030, and by 2050, we have to get to net zero. We don't have time to waste, but we're going to have to bring the entire world together. And there's nothing that can do that better than showing leadership in our country again. And that's what's happening.
Well, I know the administration has tried to show leadership on solar, Gina. So an esoteric question. It's one that we've been watching here with reports that the White House is preparing to and is expected to remove a tariff exemption for two-sided, double-sided solar panels, which, as it turns out, are the vast majority of those imported. People are using two-sided panels whether they need to or not. And domestic manufacturers are calling for this exemption to create more domestic manufacturing. Should it happen?
Well, I'm going to let this administration make those difficult decisions while I sit in my home and contemplate these issues. But I think that the president, I think he showed you today with some of the announcements that he is making every single day on climate and clean energy, that he's investing $7 billion in grants so that we can actually move forward with solar for all. And this is about making sure that low-income communities have an opportunity to have solar on their homes. And this is a significant investment forward. He's looking at, advancing other efforts like the American Climate Corps. 20,000 young people are going to have an opportunity to learn about clean energy, to actually build skills, to even have access to federal government jobs, God help them. And all of this is exciting and it's new, and we're going to keep refreshing it. But you're absolutely right. There are big international issues. There are supply chain challenges. Sure. But we have managed so far to do what we needed to do to build clean energy over the past year. And we have had phenomenal success. And every decision they make in that White House, I am sure, having been there, is going to be about how to keep that success moving forward.
Well, it's good to have you back with us on this Earth Day. Gina McCarthy, former White House National Climate Advisor. We thank you for coming back to see us at Bloomberg. Coming up, what's next for the foreign aid bill now that it's passed the House? We'll dive into it next with our political panel. What it means for the president, what it means for the Speaker of the House. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
On this vote, the ayes are 311 and the nays are 112. The bill is passed.
It actually happened. The House of Representatives approving a $95 billion foreign aid bill over the weekend, one that looks a lot like the bill that passed the Senate. This now goes to the Senate. It's expected tomorrow or Wednesday to pass there on the president's promise to sign this. We're joined now by our political panel. Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner. Jeannie Shanzano, Iona University political science professor. Great to see you both on this Monday. They actually got it done, Rick. Speaker Johnson woke up this morning. He's still Speaker. The sun came up. Kind of interesting. They're calling this a win for Joe Biden, but I wonder if you see this as a win for Mike Johnson as well. Now that he has Democrats at his back and apparently Donald Trump flying cover, he's going to remain the Speaker when he comes back, isn't he?
Yeah, I think that's right. And, yeah, I think it's a win-win. And you rarely say that in Washington, that a Republican Speaker and the President Democrat can actually both be successful. But I think we saw the transformation of Mike Johnson. I think he went from a MAGA to a Reagan Republican. And that probably means he's got a target on his forehead, but it's not going to be this week. One, they're out. But two, I think there's been a shift in Congress. We're in a coalition Congress now, and the Democrats are going to back him up, and the majority of the Republican caucus will. And so I think he is Teflon Don for the balance of the term.
All right. Well, Jeannie, Rick seems to think it's a win-win for Mike Johnson, maybe also a win for Biden. But some wins also come with losses when Biden is getting ready to sign into law a piece of legislation that will provide almost $20 billion more in Israel, when there is a lot of upset around administration policy regarding Israel, especially among young people And we're seeing evidence of that on college campuses literally as we speak. How complicated is this for Biden, Jeannie?
It's very complicated. You know, you're referencing Colombia. It's been 6 days of protests now, about 100 arrested late last week. Today, Yale, 46 arrested. And of course, Joe Biden has a real challenge on his hands when we look at the polls with young people. I mean, just this NBC poll out in the last 48 hours shows the young people remain his biggest challenge for his constituency. He's got to get them out, and their enthusiasm levels alone are historically low. So you couple that with funding for Israel, which will certainly pass the Senate without conditions, and that is going to be something that makes his task of getting those people out and to vote for him that much harder. And of course, you couple that with RFK on the ballot in Michigan now, and the challenge just gets bigger. I mean, some people saying Michigan is almost lost to Biden at this point.
That's a big problem if you're someone who believes in the blue wall. Rick, the reaction to what's happening on Columbia's campus has been remarkable. A reaction from here in Washington. Joe Biden calls this blatant anti-Semitism reprehensible, dangerous. Doug Emhoff, the second gentleman, out with a statement. Anti-Semitism and hate toward Jews that we are witnessing unconscionable. The Speaker of the House, outrageous and un-American. The three Jewish House Democrats, Gottheimer, Goldman, Moskowitz, actually visiting Columbia's campus today. Is there a role for Washington to play in this after the hearings that we've seen here?
Well, you know, the President of the United States sets the moral tone for the country. And I think if you wanted him to do something to help contain this kind of spread of anti-Semitism, you would find an event or even from the Oval Office and address especially the younger people in our country about the risks of falling prey to this kind of a movement. We know that these people that Jeannie mentioned who are getting arrested, many of them are paid agitators. They're professionals. They're not students at Columbia or at Yale. And that being said, students there do have a concern about the administration's policies toward the Middle East. And I think it's time for the President of the United States to use his moral authority, take the bully pulpit, and communicate with the country writ large. It's mostly 18 to 24-year-olds who are in a tizzy over this issue. And I think he should have a conversation with them from the Oval Office. And I think there we can start to define what are the parameters of this debate. There should be no continence for anti-Semitism in our country ever. And so you can call it free speech if we want, but that's not what's happening on college campuses today.
So, Jeannie, is President Biden going about this the wrong way? I wonder what you think about Rick's point about the way this dialogue should be moving forward and the president as a moral leader.
You know, I thought his statement, the president's statement, was strong. I mean, he clearly said anti-Semitism will never be acceptable and he will condemn it at all points. I do agree with Rick. I think he does need to speak out about this and show that kind of bully pulpit leadership, if you will. These are very, very tough times on college campuses for a variety of reasons. And I also think it's important what Rick said, that once these protests started, you do have people from the outside coming in. And so now you've got a really, really tough situation on campuses with students who are afraid, who feel they're being bullied and intimidated. Others feel they don't have the right to free speech, and outside agitators coming in. It is a terrible recipe as we approach commencement season. And I do think the president, and quite frankly, presidents at our universities and colleges, need to speak out on this issue and clearly set the marker as to what is acceptable and what is not. There is a way to protest peacefully, have a right to free speech, and not allow the students on these campuses who have a right to learn to be intimidated or to be put on, as Columbia students were today, online and not get the education in person that they pay for, quite frankly, and deserve.
It's going to be an issue that follows Joe Biden on the campaign trail. And I'll tell you what, if they end up banning TikTok in the process of moving this legislation, Kayleigh, he'll have some explaining to do once again to young voters.
Yeah, after he signs this bill into law, sure, he's getting aid for Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan for that matter, but he also could make a lot of those TikTokers quite angry. Of course, we're talking about a year-long divestiture period, so it's entirely possible that that issue in particular is not resolved in advance of the election in November, but still something certainly to watch. Now, coming up, we're still watching, of course, the race for the White House as Trump is in court again in New York. Plus, as Jeannie alluded to, that NBC poll shows the impact of RFK Jr.'s candidacy on the two frontrunners. We'll have more with them next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. A jury in New York today heard opening statements from lawyers in Trump's hush money trial. Although court was adjourned early, the case is expected to take weeks. And we're back now with our political panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shan Zaino. So, Jeannie, we heard opening statements today. The prosecution saying that Trump made these payments, allegedly violating election law, and that this was election fraud, pure and simple, whereas we know Donald Trump says actually this is what's interfering with an election because this case is keeping him off the campaign trail. I just wonder how many minds are likely to change around either of those arguments. Jury, one thing, the American people, something else.
Yeah, there was an interesting piece in Slate by Dahlia Lithwick, who was talking about the fact that she thinks that that minds are being changed. In part, her argument is because of how close this election is, even a small number of minds will matter. So there is that. I don't know if we know yet, it's so early, if minds are being changed writ large. But I do think that it is possible as we go forward. You know, just the idea alone that he has to sit there 4 days a week, 8 hours, and the toll it is going to take on any individual, particularly a 78-year-old running for president and trying to function in this capacity. It's a lot to ask of a candidate or anybody. And so from all those perspectives, I think it could have an impact as we go forward.
Well, I'll tell you what, the prosecution laying out in its opening statements a pretty compelling argument here. The first payment was from Donald Trump's revocable trust after Donald Trump was reelected. The rest were paid from his own bank accounts, and he signed each of them himself while he was president. Checks were stapled to bogus invoices for approval and signature. If they close the deal on this, what will Americans think of this storyline? I know it's being called a hush money trial here, but the prosecution is trying to get to election interference. Will people buy that narrative?
Yeah, look, I think it's pretty clear, right? It was a month before the election, and it was absolutely necessary for Trump and the campaign to bury this story. He'd already gone through Access Hollywood, an incredible announcement of, really defamatory comments by him. He couldn't survive another one. This would have been it. And so, sure, yeah, absolutely, they were trying to hide it, and they used funds to do it. And that is the nexus of a violation of campaign law. So I think the fact pattern here is pretty simple to establish. And I think once you have the witnesses on the stand say, yes, he was trying to avoid this disclosure because of the campaign, by definition, it becomes a campaign spending issue. And you just have to follow the money. And I think that's where it leads you. So absolutely, there are multiple reasons why this case is relevant. And at the core of it, the federal government is trying a campaign finance violation.
Of course, he's still innocent until proven guilty. Ultimately, this will come down to the decision of a jury of his peers. But he also has other issues to worry about, Rick, not just in the legal realm, but also potentially from, say, RFK Jr. New NBC poll that Jeannie was referring to earlier shows Trump leading Biden by 2 points if it's just head-to-head. You add in those third parties, including RFK Jr., and Trump loses to Biden by 2 points. So is the poll from RFK actually polling from Trump?
Yeah, this is a classic bad April for him. It's be careful what you ask for. He loved trials until he actually had to sit in one every day. And he loved RFK until actually he started pulling out his vote. Yeah, this is actually happening. You think about it, though. Democrats have been attacking RFK. They want to try and get their vote back. They say that it's going to keep Biden from winning. So the campaigns have been much more aggressive. And here's Donald Trump saying, oh, the guy's great. We should all embrace him. In fact, some campaign people have even talked about maybe we put him on the ticket. Well, of course the Trump voters are going to like him more than the Democrats are when you have that kind of an environment. So this is a classic be careful what you ask for. You wanted him. Now you got him, and he is taking votes away from Donald Trump at a higher rate in this NBC poll and others I've seen than he is taking them from Joe Biden now.
We've got less than a minute. Jeannie, RFK Jr. on the natural law party. in Michigan that Joe Biden's going to lose to the Natural Law Party in Michigan?
Yeah, let's talk to Hillary Clinton. She can tell us that, these parties that are not well known. I mean, the Green Party, it is Earth Day. But, Jill Stein, many people claim, cost her the big state in the Midwest. So, we have to be very, very careful. And absolutely, it's a challenge for Biden, but more importantly, Trump, as Rick was just talking about.
Calls itself the fastest growing political party in the country, Kaylee.
Okay.
Natural Law Party. Learn about that today. Rick and Jeannie, it's great to see you. Thanks for taking the edge off of Monday and helping us understand the stories that we're covering here at Bloomberg. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
We'll see you tomorrow right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.